When and why did you decide to become a teacher?
Actually, it was a direct result of a job that I had prior to getting into teaching. And I was a counselor on an adolescent psychiatric unit at St. Francis in Lawrenceville, which is now Children's Hospital. St. Francis closed in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I was there for about 15, 16 years. And we worked with kids from, you name an issue, name an emotional issue, and we had those kids. And the city of Pittsburgh, by law, was required to provide them with an education because they were inpatients. They were living in the hospital. So there were 2 classrooms that were set aside, and teachers, special education teachers from the city of Pittsburgh public school system that were assigned. And we had to have a counselor. That was one of my responsibilities, to be in the back of the classroom when class was going on at all times. We did have some situations where kids attacked teachers physically. So it wasn't that, but just that, but we had to be in the room. And then we would keep notes, because when we would have team meetings at the end of the day, we would discuss each child at length and how their day went. And if you were in the classroom, you were responsible for how that child, how that patient was in the classroom. And I loved history before I got into the job at St. Francis, and I would interject once in a while. I knew not to interrupt class. And then one day, one of the teachers, not being sarcastic, being sincere, said, "Mike, if you want to do history once in a while, feel free." So I started doing it, and then one of the nurses, who I ended up marrying, said, "Mike, if you don't get into teaching, you're out of your mind." But I'm in my mid-30s, late 30s, and I don't even know if I'd get accepted into Pitt's program because of age. And they said, "No, your age had nothing to do with it." And I went to the Pitt School of Education. A lot of the credits I had for an undergraduate degree in English were transferred. I still had to make up credits that I needed through them. And then I was placed at Dorseyville Middle School for my student teaching, and it fell into place. It really did.
When you were a student, who was your favorite teacher? What made them special?
5th grade, Mrs. Claypool, because she let me read every book she had on the American Civil War. I couldn't get enough of them. I mean, that's a no-brainer. I think of her right away whenever, and, you don't get asked that question often or a lot, but when I saw it, Mrs. Claypool.
Share your teaching experience. What grades or subjects did you teach, and where and how long? When
I student taught at Dorseyville, I taught for the late Harry Scott, a great guy. He told me he was going to treat me differently. He said, "You're not a traditional student that has come out of college." He said, "Not that I think less of their ability." He said, "But I'm going to talk to you in ways I would never talk to them." He said, "You better have thick skin." And he said, "You're going to get instant feedback from me," which I really appreciated. I did. And he was asked to take an assistant principal role, because both of our assistant principals, we had 2 in those days, Dr. Fink was hired at Hartwood, and Dr. Bornius was hired in Moon Township to be principals. So when he was asked temporary assistant principal job, he recommended me as a leave replacement. So that was my first experience at Dorseyville, but I didn't have a contract. And then that came and went, and I loved it. And then I was a full-time sub, and then I did another leave replacement at Dorseyville. When I got my contract, I was low man as far as experience went. Age didn't matter. You were low man experience. So I would do 6th grade one year, 7th grade the next year. And then we had an extra team in those days because the enrollment was so high. We had A, B, C, and then there was a D team with 50 kids. So my team would do, like, for instance, I would have 2 8th grade classes in the morning and then maybe 2 7th grade classes in the afternoon. One year we did a 6-8 split. 6th graders are so much different than 8th graders. It was like I had to undergo a personality change from class to class. It was really interesting. And then finally, an 8th grade social studies teacher retired, and then they put me into that slot, and I did that for like the last 20 years. I did 8th grade social studies.
Tell me about your favorite lesson, unit, or activity that you enjoyed teaching.
It was the analysis of the famous George Washington crossing the Delaware painting, because number one, it enabled each student in the room to come up with their own take, their own analysis, their own critique, and then share them. Number two, the painting is beautiful, and unbelievably inaccurate. So the kids could go to town. And every year when we got to that point in the curriculum, I would say to myself, who is going to point out something to me that I never saw before? I learned from the kids in the classroom because every year somebody would pick up a little tiny thing and the whole class would go, oh, I didn't even, and I'd say to myself, well, I didn't see that either. I loved that lesson. I loved it.
What is the funniest or most entertaining moment you remember from your years?
Okay, this was also a Mrs. Claypool question. Bam. We were assigned by the guidance department specific lessons in home base, and well-meaning, hoping that we could enable our 8th graders to navigate 8th grade. Middle school is tough. Getting away from academics, navigating that bus stop, navigating those halls, navigating the cafeteria, changing friendships. I could go on and on and on. Being a middle school teacher wasn't just teaching history. I took pride in helping kids navigate. So we had a lesson that I was supposed to implement on rejection. The week before, we had a lesson on grief. I had kids in my home base that were in tears, and I said to myself, I'm not doing any more lessons like this. I'm not going to sit in a circle with 15, 14-year-olds and implement a lesson that's going to cause them stress or make them cry. Middle school's tough enough. So the following week, the lesson was on rejection, where they wanted the kids to talk about individual instances in their lives where they had been subject to rejection. So I'm doing hall duty with Miss Lakaitis, and I said, all right, we got that lesson today. And my home base was, everybody's talking, yakking, having a blast. And I went in and I said, hey, folks, as far as today's lesson, I'm just thinking about this. The home base lesson's on rejection. I said, instead of you telling me about, examples in your life of being rejected, it's just going to come from me. So I'll talk about my experience with rejection. And immediately, C.J. Smith, loud enough for everybody here, says, you think 45 minutes will be enough time? The class exploded in laughter. I was laughing so hard I was crying. Didn't miss a beat. Nobody can make me laugh at myself the way C.J. did. I'll never forget that ever. I was laughing harder than the kids were.
During your time as a teacher, what was the biggest change that you witnessed in your profession?
I don't want to be negative. I'll try not to make this negative, but the implementation, not the district's fault, we're talking state of Pennsylvania, of the PSSAs at Dorseyville, and it was a culture change. It really was. The teachers, not social studies teachers, I always felt guilty when I'd sit in these meetings and the pressure that would be put on language arts teachers and math teachers that I had so much respect for. The buy-in to, no, I shouldn't say buy-in, you had to. I'm not even blaming Fox Chapel, because every school district had to implement the PSSAs, and then the pressure on teachers to make sure the scores went up. And I didn't like, and I never said a word like in a meeting, because you have a job, you do your job. We were given directives, we did them, they still do. Didn't like teachers that I admired, teachers that my own children had had, they loved being now judged partly in numbers. And I didn't like kids being perceived, students being perceived as numbers. Like we'd have a team meeting at the beginning of the year and we would be given the roster and they would tell us who we had. And of course, the kids who had low PSSA scores the previous year, it would be pointed out to the language arts teachers, and I'm thinking, that's not what that kid's all about. You don't know what goes on in that kid's home. You don't know what goes on in that kid's life, and we're assigning a number to them. So it was the assigning of evaluation numbers on teachers, and it was doing the same thing to kids. And it's not going to go away. And I think if you were to get a teacher from Dorseyville now to sit here, it wouldn't bother them as much because they didn't know what it was like prior to. It would be teachers that knew what education was like before the standardized test. And that's probably a good thing. It is.
How have advances in technology such as internet and smartphones impacted your teaching career and your view on them?
Mostly positive, not all. But go back to George Washington. In the old days, when we would analyze that painting, the kids would have the textbook in front of them, and there was the painting in front of them. When we got the whiteboards, and I could project that painting on the wall, and kids could then go up to the front of the room and point and say, this is exactly what. Previously, everybody's looking at their books, and I'm walking around running laps, making sure, okay, this is what he meant, this is what she meant. That was a sea change. The ability of a kid, I'll give you a personal example. I always did an icebreaker the first week of every school year where I brought in historical artifacts, some of my dad's from World War II, and an old buddy of mine from Morningside, when we lived in Morningside, he would reenact Civil War battles, and I think he still owns a shop, Photo Antiquities on the north side, and he specializes in Civil War art and Native American, original photos of Native Americans and Civil War soldiers. And I would bring some of the stuff in, and I would put the kids in groups, and I'd say, your assignment is who, what, when, where, why. I said, and trust me, nobody is going to get all the W's. Do the best you can. Well, this one group had my father's dog tags from World War II. And my dad died when I was in 7th grade, and he would not discuss his experience in World War II. When I was able to follow where he was in General Omar Bradley's army, and when I followed what they did and where they went, and then interestingly enough, when I saw the first half hour of Saving Private Ryan, immediately I knew, because he was on Omaha Beach. And this group had my dad's dog tags, and there was a number on there. Well, I never picked up on any of this stuff. They had iPads. It was his ID number. They typed the ID number, and there it was. It was like the sun came out, because his paper records had been in a warehouse in Newark that burnt down. I had tried to get the information. They put that number in there. I was crying. It was unbelievable. And they did that with iPads and phones, okay? Oh my God. Yeah, the stuff you can do. It's just, you tell me, I'm not gonna tell you.
That's amazing.
On a negative, I still sub at Dorseyville, and this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens more often than not. I'll be out in the hall doing hall duty, and then I go in, and instead of kids talking about the weekend or what they're gonna do, I'll see this. I hate when I see that. You know, I don't like when I see that. And I'll give Mr. Niehaus credit. He's the best boss I ever had. He's tried to thread a needle. It is not a luxury. It sounds ridiculous for you to even hear somebody say that. I know that. It's a necessity. It is a necessity. But they have these things up on the walls in every classroom now, and there's these little clear compartments where you're supposed to put your phone when you come in the room. And when I started subbing in September, I would look at the back of the wall and I'd say, wow, I did not think the kids would cooperate, and it was filled. Well, I subbed for 8th grade social studies, and I looked in the back of the room after every kid had come into class. There wasn't one phone. And I asked these girls, I said, is it always empty now? And they laughed, and they said, yeah, it's just about every class. He gave it a shot, you know. And on a very serious note, I've worked with kids now, we're going on 45 years. My Achilles heel has always been the bullying. And the technology, the phones, made it easier to bully. So that's my negative on the phones.
Share with me one of your classroom management strategies or tips. How'd you handle challenging or disruptive students in a way that turned their behavior around?
It didn't always work. And I guess this comes from my St. Francis days, because the more we knew about those kids, you know, I mean, a lot of these kids had tried to commit suicide, and that's why we got them. Or they had done terrible things, and then we found out what had been done to them, okay? It gave us, the more insight you have into a person, not just a kid, a person, the better. So to the best of my ability, I would try to find out, as not being nosy, but trying to be a good teacher, as much about the kids as I could. So when we got our 8th grade rosters, we have that week where, I don't know if they still do, but it's a week where you're in the building, and you know, there's speakers that would come in, or they'd give you time to plan, or you'd meet with Mr. Niehaus, you'd meet with your department, but there was a lot of free time. So I could talk to 7th grade teachers. Tell me as much as you can about, because you'd hear, oh, you have so-and-so on your roster. Well, people change. Tell me as much as you can. I would go to the fact that the guidance counselors Ms. DeComo, as an example, she'll have the sixth graders, then she has the seventh grader, they stay with her. Same here. So nobody would have more insight to the kids than Ms. DeComo. And non-academics that's what I would ask the guidance counselors about. Is there something I need to know? Is there something I need to know that you're not allowed to tell me, okay? The more I knew about the kid, the better. And I'm also not going to sit here and lie and say I always did this, but let's face it, yelling never worked. Maybe in athletics to get people's attention or to inspire, yes. But to yell at a kid, that just makes the kid feel worse. With me, it would be, hey, let me talk to you in the hall. Take a shot. And then hopefully with the knowledge that I had about the kid, I'd say it worked 50-50. It did, yeah.
You spent decades working with young people. What did you learn about the students that you worked with?
It sounds like a cliche, but I thought about this one too. I learned from them. I still do. I learned from them. Not just in the George Washington painting, but I learned from them academic settings, and then sometimes I found out what was really going on in a kid's life. Holy mackerel. Yeah, I learned from them.
Because like you said, there are some things that you learn about them that are just like change your whole perception on them.
Yeah. To any teacher, I hate to preach, but any teacher that doesn't think they can learn from their students, they're delusional.
Can you discuss the teaching philosophy and how it guided your approach to education?
In the old days, they don't do it anymore. They had what they called move-up day. So the eighth grade, they still do that, right? The eighth grade comes here? Okay. Yeah. And when the eighth grade got on their buses, that was the signal we had our rosters for the next year. So the seventh graders would find out what team they were on. And they would be put in their groups for 8A, 8B, 8C, and they would have a schedule. They would start out, let's say, on our team with Miss Lakaitis, and then go to Mr. Price, and then go to me. And we would then give them just, tell them a little bit about ourselves and then what the course was about. And I shouldn't have done this, but I did. Mr. Lepaka never did this, Mr. Goggin never did this, but they did share this philosophy with me, that the eighth grade social studies book was unbelievably boring, okay? It was really dry and boring. And so they would come in and they'd sit down, and I would put an empty garbage can next to me, and I would hold the textbook up and I'd say, this is your textbook. And I said, if you buy into what I'm selling, and I would drop the textbook in the garbage can, I said, that's what we'll do with art. And they would cheer. They didn't know what they were. To me, it was primary sources. It was paintings. It was kids' opinions. Why read about the Second Amendment? I'd rather get a student's opinion on the Second Amendment once I was sure they understood it than read about it in a book. I mean, and even when the parents would come in, I would say, if you ever have trouble sleeping, I said, here's the textbook we've been assigned. Open up to any page, you'll fall asleep in 20 minutes. Primary sources, paintings, music. I can't draw stick figures, but as my career went on, I realized, what about my artistic kids? When do they get an opportunity? They don't have an opportunity to have their time in here, so I started incorporating art, and then the kids would analyze the historical setting. Let's say a scene from the Battle of Gettysburg that a kid with really good art skills, they would put up there, and instead of doing George Washington crossing the Delaware, now the class is analyzing a painting or a sketch done by a student in the class. It had to be, I led, but the energy, the exploration had to be led by the students, student-led. And I never said that. I wouldn't, paralysis by analysis. It evolved. As time went on, it evolved. I had very few rules. The main one, the biggest one, was you have to respect the opinion of other people in the class, even if you passionately disagree with them. And when we would have our discussions on freedom of speech, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, there were really interesting disagreements, but 90% of the time, it was cordial. It was respectful, which I loved. And I would always tell the parents at open house, the people who run Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, they should see some of the debates in these classes and take an example from the kids on 8C.
What are the most important qualities for a great educator?
Thick skin. You better be able to laugh at yourself. Please laugh at yourself. there has to be joy in the classroom. There has to be a joy in learning. And speaking for Fox Chapel, I don't think there still is. I know there still is joy. And the other thing, not just with middle school, with all kids, we don't know what happens behind closed doors. And this, once again, maybe I talk about this too much, but this goes back to my St. Francis days. And I would say to myself, look, there's going to be days where I have students come into my class, maybe this kid in 7th period or this young lady in 2nd period, and they just don't care how many times the British had to charge up Bunker Hill. Because maybe they got made fun of on the bus. Maybe they got picked on at the bus stop. Maybe something tough is going on at home. So teachers should not take a day off, but kids, every once in a while, they're going to have a day off. And if they just gave me that look, if I saw that affect and if I knew a little bit about them, I just left them alone.
What was the most challenging part of being a teacher?
You know, we would talk about stereotypes in home-based lessons, okay? And there's a stereotype of teachers that has always driven me crazy. And I'll hear it from relatives that I have. Oh, you took it because you get summers off, or you get weekends off, or you get this. No, we didn't. We did not. And I never thought about money. I didn't. But I'll use my son as an example, right? So my son graduated from here in 16, and he still keeps in touch with a lot of his buddies from Fox Chapel. A lot of them were guys he played lacrosse with. And I'll always ask, well, what's so-and-so doing? What's he doing? And what's this guy doing? And he tells me what they're doing. And he tells me what they're making. And these guys just graduated from college like 2 years ago. Some of them 3 years ago. They're making more than any teacher in this district, okay? They're all into some sort of technology. They are. And when people say, well, they're overpaid and they don't work long enough, it drives me out of my mind. And I'm willing to bet, there's no way to prove it, but I'm willing to bet in this district, because my kids went to Hartwood, my kids went to DMS, and my kids went here, 95 to 99% of the teachers in this district do it because they love it, not because they want to get rich. I hate that stereotype.
What was the most rewarding part of being a teacher?
When I would tell the kids at the beginning, I would tell the kids on move-up day, and then of course remind them in August and September, at no time will you ever be forced to contribute to a class discussion. At no time will you ever be coerced or forced into getting up in front of the room and reading a piece of analysis or a critique of a primary source or work of art or whatever. I'll never make you do that. Well, I privately encourage you to. I did it once and I regret it. Put a kid on the spot in a classroom and say, oh, come on, that was so good, you have to get up there and read it. Invariably, the shyest kids in the room, maybe by April or May, there'd be this heated discussion going on. And I would never make a big deal out of it. And I'd see the hand go up. I want to go over and hug them, but I can't. And they would give their opinion. And I wouldn't make a big deal out of it in class, but I would be overjoyed. And then later, if I saw them going to lunch or something like that, in kind of a stern voice, kind of kidding around, I'd say, hey, I got to talk to you for a second. And sometimes the kids would go, ooh, your so-and-so's in trouble. And they'd come over and I'd just give a fist. I said, yes, that was great. The look on the face, yeah, that's the reward, the look on the face. So the courage it took to finally do that and share something they had read or something they had written, or to give an opinion on in a heated debate, whether that debate was on a current event or that debate was on something that came as a result of our study of the lead up to the American Revolution or Civil War. I just called it the look.
So what do you think then about like teachers that do that? Because I know it's a very common tactic where they put people on the spot and they have no clue what's even going on. What do you think about that then?
I'll give you an example of when I did it, and I regretted it. I'm not going to say her name. She goes to Penn State, and her writing was spectacular. and her locker was right across from my room. And I would read her stuff that night. And she liked to use, instead of Schoology, she liked to use hard copy and writing. And I was blown away. And I wouldn't embarrass her in front of her friends, but I would say, and I don't want to use her first name, I'd say, you and I are the only two people that get to read this. And her face would turn crimson. Mr. Quinn, I am not going to read that in front of class. I'm not doing it. I said, okay. So the last straw for me it was a painting on Manifest Destiny. And the kids were told, you can pick any animate or inanimate object in this painting, but I want a story from that, your choice's perspective. It can be the horse, it can be the bonnet on the little girl's head, it can be tumbleweed. And I do forget the topic that she chose, but it was the best I had ever read in all the years we had done that project. So that Monday morning, I'm waiting at her locker. She makes the turn. She's not even at her locker, and she's going, no, I'm not going to read it. I said, I am begging you. She said, no, because she was so shy. So we get into class, and her friends knew that this kid could write. And the other kids, they picked up on it too. So the kids are sharing, and I almost said her name. I said, would you please read this in front of the class? And she was so angry. She said no. And then her friends started saying, come on. And I should have gotten fired for doing this. I pulled a $20 bill out of my wallet and I said, I'll give you $20 if you'll read that essay. And she said, Mr. Quinn, that's not fair. And this kid way in the back, his name was Cam, he said, I'll read it for $20. I said, you didn't write it. And that was it. So last week of school, we're breaking down some of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and I told her, I apologized to her the next day. She smiled. She said, don't ever do that again. So this is the last week of school, and she raises her hand and asks if she can come up in front of the room. I'm going to get upset now. She got a standing ovation. The whole class stood up and applauded after she read. It was almost the last day of school. The day that we were told to go home and they'd let us know when to come back for COVID, I knew that was my last day. I mean, I was retiring. I don't count Zoom as teaching. I'm sorry, I couldn't. And that night, I went to the track to walk. And who was on the track? So we walked about a mile together. I said, are you still mad at me about? She said, no. She said, I had her older sister, and she said, I told my older sister, and she said, oh, that's Mr. Quinn. He just wanted you to read it. I thought there was something symbolic about my last day as a real teacher, walking around the track, and then we shook hands and said our goodbyes, and I heard she went to Penn State, and I'm very happy for her.
If you give one piece of advice to parents and the general public about the importance of teachers and education, what would it be?
How much, and I'm saying this from my own, I'll use my own children's experience at Hartwood and the people I came into contact with and the people at Dorseyville that I knew as colleagues but also as teachers of my children and the experience my kids have here. We go back to that stereotype, which I don't want to beat up again, but the teachers that have your children in their class care about your kids, not just as students, but as people. And especially, and here I am prejudiced, in the Fox Chapel School District. Buying a house in Indiana Township, one of the best life-altering decisions we ever made because my kids got to go to school in this district.
What advice would you offer to a first-year teacher with less than 1 year of experience?
It would be a repeat of some of the things I've already said. And it would have to be phrased in a way that didn't insult them or patronize them. But remember, they're people. They're not just students. They're people. And also, it is a first year. Don't be too tough on yourself. But I remember my first year of teaching. I was nervous every day. I was nervous of how the kids perceived me. Was I doing a good job? Did the people on my team, did they think I was doing a good job? Don't be tough on yourself. and don't be tough on the kids.
And coming on our last question, what would you like to say to your former students who might be watching?
Thank you. It was an honor.